Welcome to the Central Seminary Podcast. We're delighted to have you with us today as we discuss biblical and theological issues relating to life and ministry. This podcast is a ministry of Central Baptist Theological Seminary in Plymouth, Minnesota. To learn more about Central Seminary, visit our website at www.centralseminary.edu. My name is Micah, and I'll be your host. Welcome to the Central Seminary Podcast. Today we have Dr. Kevin Bauder and Dr. Brett Williams here for a conversation entitled, Let Me Tell You How to Vote. Another way we could say is principles for Christians voting that we can think about. So Dr. Williams and Dr. Bauder, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is certainly a hot topic that we want the listeners of the podcast. Maybe you're listening here in October, it's election season, or maybe you're listening after election season, and this is something that you want to consider how to think rightly about Christians and voting, and as we desire on the podcast to talk about biblical and theological issues relating to life and ministry, this is certainly one of those. And so as we had opportunity to hear Dr. Bauder in chapel, students at Central, to hear this, and we wanted to record a conversation around these principles that come from the Word of God and how the Word of God impacts our understanding and philosophy of Christian voting. So as we begin this conversation, part of what I wanted to ask Dr. Bauder as we think about voting and election, I just want to ask you, first of all, some of the increased nature of this conversation as it comes to a pastor. Feeling the need to talk about this, was that something early in your pastoral ministry that wasn't as much, or did you feel that conversation was still a hot topic even in the beginning of your pastoral ministry?
Well, the conversation that we're having right here actually started out as an address, and I have delivered that address in a number of different forms over the years, but the first time I delivered it was in 1988, and George Herbert Walker Bush was running at that time.
Read my lips.
That's exactly the guy. Yep. That's exactly the guy, yeah. And what I was trying to do, I was pastoring in Iowa at the time. What I was trying to do was to articulate principles that would guide the people of my church as they considered how they wanted to cast their votes. And I should make this really clear. My purpose then and my purpose now is not to tell people who to vote for. I don't think that's my place as a pastor or as a theologian. In fact, I would say politics doesn't have any place in the pulpit. I believe pretty strongly in what some would call the spirituality of the church. The mission of the church is about evangelism and discipleship. It's summarized in Ephesians chapter 4. It's all about bringing believers to maturity. It's not about getting involved in political campaigns. It's not about getting involved in social activities. It's really about the whole counsel of God. But the whole counsel of God affects every area of our lives. There are moral principles that come to bear in every area of our lives. And so what I've wanted to do is to try to articulate the moral principles that ought to be guiding us when we are considering for whom to vote. Will I vote for this person or that person? Well, how do I evaluate their platform? How do I evaluate what they say they are going to do? That's what I'm trying to get after here.
Yeah, I wanted to give a caveat, maybe even for our listeners thinking, one, anybody in the United States has an immediate application for this, even thinking for our listeners around the world. We're thankful for the many of international students that we have who might be asking the question, listening to this, say, hey, I don't get to vote, or that it's different for me. How can we even caveat some of this conversation overseas?
Well, that's a great question, because this is a burden for us in America. It's by burden, I don't mean it's burdensome to us, but it is a responsibility that we bear because we participate in the political process. Nobody gets into office without being elected, and we're the people who do the electing, which means that whatever God holds government's responsible for, and however God judges governments, he's going to hold us responsible for, and he's going to judge us to some degree. So we have the responsibility to act and to choose rightly at the really low level that we do. Recognizing, there are millions of other people doing the same thing, and no one of us has a really huge voice, but the little tiny voice we have, we've got to use in the right way. But I recognize not every country in the world is, I'm going to use the word democracy here, recognize somebody out there is going to say, we're not a democracy, we're a constitutional republic, and yes, absolutely, I agree with that. But democracy in the sense that our form of government is participative. The people elect the officials. And that's not the case in every country in the world. I have a friend who had a little maxim that I think is useful in a lot of areas of life, and it goes like this: when there's no choice, there's no problem. In countries where you don't get to choose who's governing, then you're not responsible for the things I'm talking about. To you, this is going to be more a curiosity than anything.
Yeah.
So I think these are principles that do apply globally, right? As Kevin said, so say you're not in a government, you can then be involved, participate. Well, you can still understand these principles for what they are, seeing what government should do. And certainly in my experience and some of my friends, you never know what's going to happen. For many decades, a central seminary had a ministry in the country of Romania. Okay, I know Kevin and myself both have some good friends over there who are pastoring, who when they were growing up underneath a dictatorship, especially underneath communism, they would have never dreamed that they would have a say in their government until 1989. The revolution happened, right?
Right.
Hence, all of a sudden, within a period of months, am I correct, you had these people being thrust into some sort of a representative democracy, and many of these men were pastors or training to be pastors, who therefore had to instruct their people in what to do. So you never know what's going to happen. So I do think these are global principles.
They're worth paying attention to, yes.
Yeah. So the title, Let Me Tell You How to Vote. But there are caveats that you're going to, that you certainly mention as you come to this. The caveats with specific, are you going to tell us candidate? You're going to tell us those things. What are limitations that you would also be very clear about as we come?
That is explicitly not my purpose.
Exactly.
I do not want to tell you whom to vote for.
Yes.
What I do want to do is to help to equip you to be able to vote intelligently when the time comes, to be able to vote in the way that Christian principles say you should vote when the time comes. And of course, one of the issues we're going to have to ask or address is this. I'm going to have 10 criteria that I'm going to lay out over the course of this conversation. When we get to the end of the 10 criteria, anybody who's paying attention is going to say, well, we don't have any candidates like that. So the question is, when you don't have any candidates like that, how do you choose? And we're going to have to loop back around and get to that. But no, we're not going to talk about supporting this candidate or that candidate. We're going to ask what makes a candidate worth supporting.
So as we begin to think about those issues, there are two caveats, two other parts of the issues that you encourage people in identifying how to vote. So we're talking the how to vote, this process. What is something that you're careful to say about the issues that you say, what are not the issues when it comes to Christian voting?
I do think, my first pastorate was in a heavy union town. And by the way, I believe in unions. I think there is a place for unions when they are functioning rightly. And one of the things that happened in my town was that the union was telling people how to vote, which included a lot of my church members.
Sure.
And the union had a very definite political agenda that they were telling these people. And it's not that what the union was telling them was bad. It's just that what the union was telling them was not a matter of biblical principle. And I have seen over the years a number of Christians and Christian broadcasters articulate criteria that I thought were really criteria that shouldn't be articulated. So let me mention 2 items that I think should not determine our voting. Number 1 is whether the candidate professes faith, whether the candidate claims to be a Christian. All other things being equal, probably it's better to have a Christian in government than a non-Christian in government. But other things are hardly ever, if ever, equal. So I'm going to say that government is not a spiritual function. It is a natural function. It's a matter of common grace rather than saving grace. I am less concerned with whether the candidate is a Christian, professes faith in Christ, professes loyalty to Christ. I am more concerned with 2 things. One is whether the candidate holds the right principles in governing, and the other is whether this is a candidate who will actually be able to govern when elected. I know a lot of people who believe the right things and hold the right principles would be absolute disasters in government. So those are going to be my primary concerns. It's not going to be whether the individual is a Christian or not. The other question is the question of prosperity. A lot of people, probably most people these days, seem to think that the primary role of government is to increase their wealth and comfort. I'm going to say that as a practical matter, I like to have my wealth and comfort increased. Which of us doesn't?
Yeah.
We don't really want to be made any poorer, but at the same time, that's not really the role that government has been assigned. And whenever government strays into that role, it almost always, if government tries to plan an economy, it almost always turns out to be a disaster. Now, when Reagan was elected, he came into office on a platform of supply-side economics. A lot of people called it Reaganomics. His opponents called it voodoo economics. Yep. Honestly, the economic program has proven itself. But the point of supply-side economics is not that the government gets involved in the economy, it's that the government gets out of the economy. Mm-hmm. It lets the economy loose to do what the economy does. Now, his enemies attacked him hard for that. They accused him that all that was going to do was make the rich richer and the poor poorer, that we were all going to be worse off because of Reaganomics. And so at the end of his first term, they're saying all this stuff, and he's running for his second term. He just poses the question, are you better off? And as a defensive response, I think that was brilliant. It was magnificent because all of us were better off after 4 years of Reagan than we had been under Carter. The economy under Carter was an absolute disaster. So yeah, are you better off? As a response to the accusation that you're going to make things worse, I think it's a great response. But as a general principle for evaluating governments, I think that's a disaster. The question in moving from administration to administration should not be, are you better off? Has the government made me wealthier? Has the government found a way to get me more stuff? That's a really poor way of making our choices. It's bad political philosophy. It's bad theology. So what I'm going to say is that we ought to be guided in our political choices by principle rather than by possessiveness. We ought to be guided in our political choices by convictions rather than by commercialism. So I'm not going to make my political choices based on whether I think a particular government is going to make me wealthier or not. In fact, we're probably in a situation today where the only way the thing is going to be fixed is if we're willing to take a short-term hit while everything gets evened out again.
Yeah. The conversation that we're beginning now, and we're turning it to what are the issues. We've given enough to say what we're very careful to begin this conversation. So beginning that, you mentioned 10, and so we're going to definitely put a pin in getting through those, the ones that we can get through on this episode of the podcast, and then the next episode. So asking that question, what are the issues, and how do we think rightly about how to vote as a Christian?
I'm going to say the issues I'm going to name, I'm not necessarily listing in order of importance. Sure. But I do think they're all important. We ought to take them all into account. Some of them, for me, are make it or break it issues. In other words, I won't support a candidate who won't support this. Some of them are let's do the best we can kind of issues. But the first one on my list is that a candidate needs to have a reputation for integrity. And I think this is a biblical principle. Psalm 29:2 says, when the righteous are in authority, the people rejoice, but when the wicked beareth rule, the people mourn. So does this candidate have a reputation for personal integrity? And we know that by looking at the track record this person has in keeping, especially not just in keeping his or her word when he or she says, I'm going to do this or I'm going to do that. But the question is, what does this person do with vows? Mm-hmm. And the most obvious test there is going to be the marriage vow. The marriage vow is an oath. You are swearing an oath when you get married. And I think it's a real simple rule of thumb. A person who is willing to trifle with his marriage oath or her marriage oath, there's no reason to expect that that person is going to respect an oath of office. We're getting accused right now from the left of being hypocritical on this point because it was a big deal when Clinton was running for office. Here, obviously, is a man to whom a marriage oath meant virtually nothing. And then we had another president come along to whom a marriage oath appears to have meant little or nothing, and yet many evangelicals voted for that individual. I'm going to say we can't give up the principle. The marriage oath still matters. Integrity still matters. And I'm not willing to give anybody a free pass on that issue. In fact, it's important because at some point, I can still remember after 9/11 when George Bush, when W, stood up with his charts and graphs, and he was talking about Iraq, and he was saying we believe, to the best of our intelligence, there are WMDs here, and there are WMDs here, and there are WMDs here, and he was asking us to go to war. And really, at that point, the question becomes, do you believe the man or don't you? If you have a leader who simply is not believable, then at that point you have no way to make the choice. Now, Bush was believable, and by the way, I can still remember the slogan, Bush lied, people died. I don't believe for a moment that George Bush lied about those things. I think he may have had some bad information, but I think he was acting in good faith with the best information that he had. And this, of course, we're not trying to reelect George Bush here, yeah, which is why I don't feel any hesitation in talking about the episode. But there are other presidents I could name that if they simply stood up and said, you have to take my word for it, my response is going to be, I don't think I can do that. I can remember one who plagiarized in his first presidential campaign. And, people referred to him as "Play It Again, Sam," back in those days. And I've never been able to trust that president. I haven't been able to believe a word that comes out of his mouth, not without some external verification. So I think personal integrity is a really big deal. Now, of course, the question becomes, what if you have two candidates, neither of whom has personal integrity? And if I can punt that question, that's one of those things I want to wait.
Put a pin in that one.
Yeah,
we'll come back.
We need to talk about all 10 of these before we come back around and ask, okay, what if the candidate doesn't measure up here, doesn't measure up here, doesn't measure up here? And unfortunately, I actually think this is the wave of the future. I think we are likely for the foreseeable future to have candidates who are deeply compromised when it comes to personal integrity. I think that's lamentable.
If I could buttress this a little bit, I think there's an important nuance because there's a definite distinction there should be, I think, between a vow, a promise, right? Let's say character, integrity, and someone's policy.
Yeah.
Right? Now, there is a connection. There's no question about that. Policy should be based upon character and integrity. However, policies can and do evolve, right? So they react, they enact. They're very fluid things because they're in real time, if I can use that phrase. Whereas, say an oath, right? Think of let's say your marriage, right? 23 years ago, I swore an oath. It was one of the only oaths I've ever taken. Right, it was before God and many witnesses about my wife. Okay, our relationship will evolve over time. I'm learning more things about her. I've changed in some of my opinions on X, Y, Z. However, that oath is completely granite, right? So I think there is a distinction. Several years ago, there was a political commentator who was well known. I'm not going to use his name. But in defending a particular president, he said character doesn't matter. Not only is that unchristian, I think it's unsound.
Yeah, character always matters.
It always matters, especially in politics, because even though policies may evolve, what is the undergirding, what's the foundation of that policy? So I think Kevin is absolutely right that certainly integrity should matter. Matter of fact, I think Christians in voting should look more for that character and integrity necessarily than certain policies. Now, again, there's a connection. But have a candidate who in the 1980s believed one thing and the 1990s believed another. That happens, correct? It's happened with all of us, even theologically.
Or the classic example, earlier on, you made reference to George H.W.'s statement, read my lips, yes. No new taxes.
Right.
Well, he reneged on that. He thought there was reason in the changing situation. Yeah. But he had made the statement so strongly that it was viewed as a violation of trust, actually by both left and right.
Yeah. Yes, and I think that's... say a particular problem, especially now. I think it was Dr. Clearwaters, the founder of our institution, who said this, and I'm sorry, I don't know the page and verse necessarily, but he said, we used to have someone who was a statesman. Now we have simple politicians, right? So politician, that weather vane, they'll say nearly anything to get votes or constituencies. They'll flip-flop back and forth. A statesman is someone who's driven by principle, who serves the populace, who may evolve over time, like I said, reacting to certain circumstances. So if you say no new taxes, right, well, and then a dictator in Iraq invades a smaller country, right, and you have to go to the war, how are you going to pay for that, right? So these things evolve, but I do think as an American, I'll speak to this, we don't have many statesmen left.
Yeah, and I still remember one of my seminary professors making the statement. He said, if you think politics is an easy business, you should try sitting on the fence with your ear to the ground.
How apropos is that?
Yeah. So as the character is important for this, coming to other issues that's going to impact the issues that matter. Those issues that matter to Christians, one of those first and foremost that you list is right to life. That's going to have an impact on how we treat the least among us. That's the essence of character. It's not going to be what somebody can do for me, but what is the nature that we see biblically of each person and the value of each person.
Right, and this is the second item on my list, the right to life. And what I have in mind there is specifically the abortion issue, although it's now broader than that because we've got assisted suicide. There are places where we're beginning to see the practice of euthanasia. So right to life isn't just about abortion, but it's still largely about abortion. Most theologians, or at least most conservative theologians, would agree that the institution of human government traces to the Noahic covenant after the flood, and probably the core of it is Genesis 9:6. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. If that really is, and I think it is, the institution of government in its most rudimentary form, then the most central function of any government is to protect the lives of the innocent. Most fundamental duty of government is to protect the lives of the innocent. And it would be difficult to imagine someone more innocent than an individual who hasn't even been born. Now, of course, we believe in the doctrine of original sin. We believe that even babies are already fallen. They have a sin nature. And in fact, that's biblical. David in Psalm 51:5 says, "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me." David is saying, from the moment I was conceived, I was a sinner. But his saying that means if David was a sinner, then he had to be a moral agent, even at the moment of his conception. Even though he hadn't done anything right or wrong yet, even though he was just this tiny being, tiny person in his mother's womb, he was a person. He was a human being, even at that point. But of all human beings, nobody could be more innocent than the unborn. If the role of government, if the duty of government is to protect the lives of the innocent, then the duty of government is to protect the lives of the unborn. I'm going to stick my neck out here and say that I think our nation has a lot to answer for. The killing of millions of innocents has been a serious national travesty. We are guilty. That doesn't mean we are all equally guilty. You've never aborted anybody. I've never aborted anybody. And in fact, we have worked against that practice. But our nation as a whole stands guilty of this terrible, terrible crime. And so I'm going to suggest that, and by the way, this is one of my non-negotiables. I'm going to vote for candidates who are going to issue executive orders, who are going to pass laws, who are going to appoint or approve judges, who are willing to end the travesty of abortion on demand.
So I'm thinking of actually Abraham Lincoln in his second inaugural address. Right, so the war was ending. It was clear the Union would be victorious, and I'm not going to quote it because I'll murder it. However, it was clear that he was acknowledging that perhaps this bloody civil war where 600,000 people, Americans, died.
Which was a huge percentage of the population.
Massive. We have experienced nothing like that. Even World War II, it was nothing like that. It was an event, I think, that shifted, obviously, the course of this country and many others, by the way. However, in that address, he acknowledged that this was perhaps divine, let's say, judgment. This was recompense. Now, I am not extrapolating that in any way. I'm saying I agree with Kevin in that our nation, among many others, but ours in specific, has great blood on its hands. And God would have every right, and he would indeed be righteous as he is. I do think that, to stick my neck out a little bit, evangelicals, as a voting bloc, if we can call them that, I guess, have not always been very, let's say, consistent on this issues.
I think that's fair.
Issue. It wasn't until the 1970s that this became a central issue within evangelicalism. And to give a nod to the Roman Catholics, I think it's because their understanding of natural law, they have been very consistent on this issue. And I for one, am glad that evangelicals, it wasn't until the 1970s, and really, I'll say when it comes to politics, seemingly in the 1980s with the moral majority, this has become some sort of a central issue. And I agree. I mean, it is a central issue. It's awfully hard to either pull a lever or push a button or fill in a circle for someone, and you see a name and you know they support the murder of innocents. I just don't know how a Christian can do that with their conscience. I know there are other issues out there. However, this should be a foundational issue.
Yeah, this is one, I don't think there's wiggle room on this one. I won't support a candidate I won't vote for a candidate who won't oppose abortion. Now, having said that, I don't want to draw this too tightly. There are exceptions in which abortion is not murdering an innocent individual. Everybody talks about, in fact, for last night was the debate between President Trump and Kamala Harris, and I caught maybe 30 seconds of the whole thing.
That was all it took, right?
but I did hear Kamala Harris saying something about, women bleeding to death in the parking lot because they couldn't get an abortion to save their lives. I am really skeptical. Has that ever happened anywhere? I don't know of anywhere that would be permitted to happen, and
certainly not legally.
So.
Yeah, certainly not legally.
Yeah, when it's a question of saving the life of the mother or losing both, then and abortion is, I would say, it's a matter of self-defense. And I'll talk later on about the importance of self-defense, the responsibility of self-defense. So if you're aborting a baby to save the life of a mother, I've got no problem with that. And I think laws need to be written in such a way as to respect that kind of thing. Still, that doesn't really reverse the overall issue here.
Yeah.
And we can't be so eager to get to the exceptions that we're willing to gloss over the principle. And the principle is, when you abort an unborn baby, you are taking the life of a human being.
Yes, and I think evangelicals especially should be known for this ideal. Not only the choice, not only the moral aspect, the real sort of maybe on-the-ground aspect. It is a joy when I get to see or volunteer for or be a part of in any way something like a crisis pregnancy center. I think churches need to get behind those and show that this is a central issue, and it's not simply about how you vote, it's about how you live.
It really is, and I celebrate evangelicals and others who have actually built crisis pregnancy centers where they are saving babies, they are equipping mothers, they are helping future families. It's not just a question of, okay, you can't abort your baby, so now what do you do with it? It's we're going to help you here. And I think that's perfectly legitimate. I think it's one of the things that we ought to be doing. And I celebrate it where we are. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, the same people who oppose a pro-life position, they want to say they are pro-choice, they're really pro-abortion. Mm-hmm. If they were, and you can see that because in many states now they are making it harder for crisis pregnancy centers to exist. Yes,
including our own. Yes,
where those crisis pregnancy centers aren't actually going to recommend abortion or refer to an abortion, and that's again, we come back to the same principle. If you've got a candidate who's going to keep you from helping a woman keep her baby, you can't have candidates like that in office.
Yeah, and this is of maybe personal interest. While I was pastoring, my wife was a director of a crisis pregnancy center down in southern Minnesota. So we dealt with this firsthand. And it was interesting, the hoops that she had to jump through even back then. Now, they're even more so. But there is not a doubt in my mind. I remember talking with someone who was left-leaning, let's put it that way. And they said, well, you sort of pro-life people and you pastors, right? Your only concern is about the life of the baby or the fetus, quote unquote. You don't care about the life of the mother. So it was a joy for me to say, have you seen this institution that my wife directs? Have you seen the women who are in our church who are being helped, the young single mothers? Have you seen the millions of dollars that God's people are pouring in? Actually, those institutions are doing more for the lives of mothers and families than any government ever could.
And in a more accountable way.
Yep.
The third point that you mention is the rule of law.
Yeah. And this one's a little more abstract, and it involves more than one element. Back during the Puritan era, there was a Puritan thinker by the name of Samuel Rutherford who wrote a book in which he was exploring the question of the Christian's relationship to government. And he ended up titling the book Lex Rex, which means the law is king. And the thesis that he argued for in that book is that even civil authorities, even kings, cannot have rightly arbitrary power to do whatever they want. Even kings are bound by law. And of course, in the English legal tradition, you see that principle growing at minimum from the Magna Carta onward. You see that principle developing until you get to the present day, where you have very definitely a constitutional monarchy in the UK, and the king can do almost nothing on his own initiative. But I think the principle is not only a sound one, but a biblical principle as well. You've got this episode back in the book of Ezra, where the children of Israel have come back into the land. They are rebuilding the temple, and their opponents appeal to the Persian emperor, and they ask him to stop the building. And their reason is, they say, if you look in your records, you will discover that the Jews have been a recalcitrant people. They have always been ready for revolution. They have been nothing but trouble for the kings. And if you let them rebuild the temple, that's all going to start all over again. So you better just put an end to it. And the emperor does the search of the records, and he finds out all that is true. And so he sends word to the Jews and says, you stop building the temple. And they do. Except God sends Haggai and Zechariah, and these two prophets get the people building the temple again. Well, then, of course, the question is, who told you that you could do this? And you might think that the Jews would respond, as the apostles did in the book of Acts, we ought to obey God rather than men. But that's actually not what they say. In their appeal to the emperor, they say, if you search your records, you will discover that we are building the temple because King Cyrus, the first Persian emperor, gave us a mandate to come back here and build the temple, and he provided the means and mechanisms by which we would do that. Well, if you know anything about Medo-Persian custom, once an emperor enacted a law, that law couldn't just be withdrawn. And so you've got Cyrus's decree is the law of the Medes and Persians. Yeah. And what they're saying is, we are still under Cyrus' decree. Even you, the emperor, don't have a right to retract this previous decree. So the emperor goes and he has a search made of his records, and sure enough, he finds the decree. And the next thing you know, he is sending a letter to the enemies of the Jews and saying, get away from those people. Let them rebuild the temple. Oh, and by the way, if they need any help, if they need any supplies, you give it to them. And the principle to which the Jews were appealing under that circumstance was, even the emperor is bound by law. The emperor has to respect the law. We find a similar episode in the New Testament when Paul and Silas have been arrested in the city of Philippi. They're preaching the gospel. Paul casts a demon out of a fortune-telling slave girl. Her masters, of course, have now lost income from this. They stir up a riot. Paul and Silas are taken by we would say the police, and under the authority of the town council, they are stripped, they're scourged, which is a severe beating, probably left their backs looking like shredded wheat. And they're put into stocks in the jail in the middle of the night. And of course, everybody knows the story about how there's the earthquake and the doors come open, none of the prisoners run away, the Philippian jailer is saved. But the narrative picks up in Acts 16, about verses 35 and 36, when the town council sends word to the jailer and basically says, get those guys out of town. And so in verse 36, the keeper of the prison told this saying to Paul, the magistrates have sent to let you go. Now, the let you go there isn't just permission. This is actually a third-person imperative. He's saying, the magistrates are saying in a very dismissive way. They're not addressing it directly to Paul and Silas. It's a dismissive way. Get those guys out of town. And the jailer says, yeah, go ahead, leave, depart in peace. But Paul said unto them, they have beaten us openly and uncondemned, being Romans, which is significant because Romans had certain legal protections. They've cast us into prison, and now do they thrust us out privily? They want to sneak us out of town? Paul says, nay, verily, King James language, absolutely not, no way. But let them come themselves and fetch us out. And sure enough, the police, the sergeants, told these words to the magistrates, the town council, and they feared when they heard that they were Romans. So and Philippi, the interesting thing is Philippi is actually a Roman colony.
Yes.
When you are in Philippi, you are in Rome.
Yep.
So if ever Roman law ought to hold sway, Philippi is a place where it ought to hold sway. And here, they've arrested 2 Roman citizens without so much as putting them through a trial. They have ordered them to be stripped. They have ordered them to be scourged. They've ordered them to be imprisoned. And now they want to get them out of town quietly. Paul is saying, we're not having any of this. You want us to leave town, you're going to come down here and apologize to us. And as the narrative goes, that's exactly what the town council does. They come down and they beg Paul and Silas to leave without trouble. And the trouble now is going to be trouble for the town council. It's not going to be trouble for Paul and Silas. But again, the principle is the same thing. The civil authorities are bound by the law. Civil authorities have to play by the rules. They have to uphold the law. They can't step outside the law in what they're doing. And this principle, I think, comes directly across to our situation. So, what's the highest law of the land? Well, it's the Constitution, right? The Constitution can't just mean anything that 5 justices say that it means. It means what it says. 5 justices don't have the prerogative, in the name of its being a living document or something like that, to step outside the meaning of the Constitution itself and to begin to act as a legislative body. That is not within the purview of the courts. In fact, I would go so far as to say that a Constitution that can mean whatever 5 justices say it means is exactly the same as no Constitution at all. And for a long time, we have been functioning in the U.S. de facto without a Constitution. The court has taken the place of the Constitution. That's something that was reversed between 2016 and 2020. We now have a court that is trying to say, this is what the Constitution says, we're going to do it the way the Constitution says. They're not making up new law, they're actually refusing to make up new law, and they're even overturning past decisions where the court has made up new laws. I think this is a very good thing, and we ought to be voting for candidates who are going to ensure those kinds of justices are on the court. We need to be looking for justices who are actually going to interpret the Constitution rather than imposing their own meaning on it, which means a president who's going to appoint we used to call them constructionists, now we call them originalists.
Yeah.
A president who is going to appoint originalist justices. We need senators who are going to approve originalist justices. And we need these same kinds of attitudes and mentalities all the way down through the political process, not just at the national level, but at the state level and even at the local level. There's I think, another issue that's involved here where I talk about rule of law. Quite apart from the law of the land, there is another law by which we are governed. When you read the Bible, and you read the commands in the Bible, some of them are for all people at all times in all places. Some of them are for specific individuals in specific situations. So God says to Abraham, take your son up on Mount Moriah, sacrifice him there. That's a command for a particular individual at a particular situation. When my son was born, I didn't have to worry about obeying that command. Okay? But there are other commands that are for all people at all places in all times. Those commands are called the moral law. All people are actually under God's moral law. I'm not suggesting that we should impose God's moral law as the law of the land, But here's the thing. God's moral law has been worked into the created order itself, such that the world doesn't work. The further you get from God's moral law, the more difficult it becomes to function within the real world. So take, for example, a couple of commands. Thou shalt not steal. If you imagine a civilization where everybody just takes whatever they want from anybody else whenever they want it, pretty quickly, any possibility of trade, any possibility of commerce, any possibility of self-improvement, all of that breaks down. If all people are stealing and they're doing it all the time, your civilization is going to be severely hampered. And can you imagine a world governed by Bernie Madoffs? I mean, this is what we're asking for if we throw away that injunction. Thou shalt not lie. Can you imagine a situation in which everybody lies about everything all the time? So you take your car to the mechanic, and the mechanic says, oh yeah, I fixed your brakes for you there in perfect working order, but he's lying. Is this going to be a good thing? Well, no. And when you find out how bad it is, it's going to be too late. Or an engineer who says, yeah, that bridge across the Mississippi, that's okay, you can send interstate traffic over it. And then you find out, no, that's not true. So God's moral law is actually worked into the created order, and to some extent, to the extent that we want a society and government to be successful, I'm not going to say that our civil laws need to enact God's moral laws, but I am going to say that civil law needs to enact as much of the moral law as can be seen through common grace within the natural order. So, thou shalt not kill or commit murder. What happens if everybody is allowed to commit murder whenever they wanted to? And the answer is probably most of us wouldn't be here. And what you end up with is a civilization, if you can call it that, in which the most vicious and predatory are the ones who absolutely dominate everybody else. And your world collapses when you ignore God's moral laws. So to the extent that collapse can be seen within the natural order and can be glimpsed through common grace, I think we have to elect civil authorities who are going to work toward making sure civil law lines up with what I'm going to call natural law.
Can I bring an example into that?
Yeah.
Because I'm not going to do a podcast without saying something from Augustine. So Augustine worked it out this way, and certainly, Kevin, this will speak, I think, to your point, right? Because so often we have been taught, I know even as a child I was taught, that these laws, even the Constitution, or, let's say parliamentary ideals or whatever, they're simply man-made things. Now, on one hand, that's true, right? So humans wrote the Constitution of the United States. Humans authored the Magna Carta. There have been decrees and declarations, etc., from kings and emperors and conquerors. However, those simply are not, I'll say, only human-made ideals. I'm not saying they're co-authored or anything like that.
Yeah, they're not.
However, yes,
inspired.
They're not divinely inspired. However, as Kevin said, they should and they do reflect something higher. Here's where Augustine comes in. He had four sort of, I think what he called, species of laws. Number one, the eternal. That's God. He is the law. He is the cosmological constant, if I can use that, right? Anything he is simply not because it's true. It is truth. He himself is love. He himself is truth, right?
Which is important. What that means is there's not a law over God
exactly
that he's implementing.
Yeah.
nor is he just arbitrarily declaring something to be thus or so.
Yeah.
Rather, right and wrong is built into his very nature.
Exactly. So it's not that truth and righteousness are some sort of a continuum in which he dwells, like he has to obey a law. He is truth and righteousness. It is his very nature. He is the highest. He is the ideal, right? So that would be species number one. Hence, everything below this has to reflect that ideal. So you have the eternal, which is God. Then number two, you have the natural law, the order, as Kevin talked about. How the universe functions, how it works, is an inclination. It's a reflection of its creator. So if you see something in creation, now as Christians, remember, we also have to bring in the fall to this, right? Because we understand that creation is not ordered the way it should be. There's disorder. However, originally it was. I'm thinking, the words of Paul, all of creation groans, right? Because even rocks and hills and animals groan in some sense to return to the sinless state, as it were, that creation was in. So this natural law has to be then above these human ideals, above human laws. So any good and worthy human law, which this would be species number 3, this is what Augustine calls the temporal law. Those are things that humans create. However, they do so within the natural sense or order, within the clear understanding of how God has ordered his world. And I would argue any law or any legislative body that somewhat, let's say, closely respects or reflects, let's say, God's natural law, should be seen as a positive by a Christian. And that doesn't mean they get everything right.
Right.
Because the fall is still here. The order of the universe, even though it's set by God, sin is entered in. And of course, death through sin, right? However, certain things I think should be seen through that lens, which is why I think you could even go from Cyrus to other Old Testament rulers, which is why they even, certainly these are pagans, right, who rejected the law of Moses in a sense, yet reflected it in so many ways. And I think this is clear. There is a law written upon the hearts of men. So they even recognized, even as emperors, even with immense power, they were underneath something. There was something that transcends the temporal. So we have temporal laws that are written by men and women. Certainly as Christians, we should respect those laws. However, we should long for laws, temporal laws, that reflect the natural laws. And then number 4, this would be species number 4, Augustine, you have the divine law, which certainly is what Kevin refers to. That's God's very specific law through or for a specific, I'm going to say dispensation. I will maybe tip my hat, right? Or tip my cards, I should say. That's a law written through space and time that does reflect his character. It reflects the natural law. However, it's for a specific situation in a specific time and place. How those 4 maybe species interact, that's a key. I think one of the angst or contradictions in our society is, on one hand, we now worship nature. It has become...
This is a whole other podcast.
Right. Yes, I'm just saying, I'd love to hear Kevin's thoughts eventually on this, but I'm just saying we have deified it. Mother Earth, right? Or you see that people have now replaced the word God with the universe. The universe gave me, the universe sent me. So on one hand, we deify the natural world. On the other hand, we entirely reject it simultaneously because we go against natural order all the time. And I think that's one of the angst of, let's say, paganism, that it sees matter as eternal, right? And therefore you should deify it. Yet on the other hand, you reject its plain understanding. This has been shown, throughout theological and even intellectual history, not simply by those who maybe we would side with. You think like John Locke, his whole idea of moral law, right? He's got these 2 ideas. Number 1, it has to be seen through plain, he called reason as well as experience. Okay?
Particularly experience.
Yes. So it's our experience that the wolf hunts the rabbit. The rabbit does not hunt the wolf. That's a natural order. Okay? Okay, then number 2, he says it has to be given by God. So those 2 things. You even go to someone like Thomas Hobbes, who wasn't a tiger nor stuffed. Wink, wink. he said natural or moral law, right, is something that is given by reason so that humans don't self-destruct. I'm going to paraphrase here, right? You even see someone like Aquinas, right? He talks about this idea of natural law or moral law, right? And it's given by the light of reason. He uses that phrase, Aristotle, wink, wink, right? The light of reason that's given by God to all men. So there's this whole order that human laws should reflect. And I think as Christians, as Kevin mentioned, whether you're voting for a candidate or you are supporting maybe a body of, let's say, jurisprudence or whatever, that should be seen as a goal of yours, that how closely do these individuals or these documents correspond with God's natural law?
And when we call it God's natural law, that doesn't necessarily mean that you even believe in God to be able to see it. It's just the way the universe works. It's the way the world works. You sometimes hear people say, you can't legislate morality. My response is, you can't legislate anything else.
That's the whole point of legislation, right?
That's why you legislate, because there is an ought. It ought to be this way rather than that way. Now, there may be arbitrary elements. We know that we've got to have a speed limit on the highway. Exactly what the speed limit ought to be, that may be a little bit arbitrary, but we know it's got to be set someplace. And so we authorize certain individuals who we think are probably qualified to set the speed limit in any given location. But we know that if we had no speed limit, there would be yahoos out there that would be crashing into us and we'd be dying. So there is an ought there. I'm going to go so far as to say that if there isn't a real ought behind it, then the imposition of a law is tyranny. You've got to have morality behind it. You've got to have an
I would agree with that, yes.
Or it's not a good law.
The laws, though there may be a pragmatic element or application to them, never should be based upon some sort of pragmatism. Right? It should be based upon that moral ought. This should happen.
It's going to lead us to the next point. We're gonna save that for the next episode. So we're gonna hold there because it's a key one that you mentioned in chapel. Just as, hey, this is one I really gotta to hone on. So I'm gonna hold that.
Are you saying this is going to turn into 3 broadcast episodes?
It may have to. We'll see. So
Speaking of laws, I would like to plead the 5th.
Yes. So this is a phenomenal conversation to begin, and we really started it, laid that foundation. We're going to pick this up in the next episode to continue with the 4th issue, that as we look at how do we think about a Christian and voting, and so I hope that you'll listen in with us, and thank you, Dr. Bauder. Thank you, Dr. Williams.
And if somebody needs an incentive to come back, the next thing we're going to be talking about is the reality of marriage, sex, and gender.
So we'll pick up with that. Hot topic. We'll pick up with that on the next episode. Thank you for listening. Thanks for listening to the Central Seminary Podcast. Our mission at Central Seminary is to assist New Testament churches in equipping spiritual leaders for Christ-exalting biblical ministry. Since its founding in 1956, Central Seminary has sought to provide serious students of God's Word with robust theological education as they prepare for ministry. We have graduates around the world who are serving in countless ways to spread the gospel and proclaim the name of Jesus Christ. Find out more at our website, centralseminary.edu.